All right, so let's get started. Thank you all for joining us for this webinar on fall gardening um, with my colleague from Growing Gardens, Emily, and my name is Jacob. And does it go forward? There. So I just wanted to take a moment to acknowledge that we are on land stolen from the original people of this region. So the Cowlitz, Cathlamet, Clackamas, Atfalati, Kalapuya people have called this region home since time immemorial. And they are the original stewards of this land, and they continue to be the stewards that guide us all today. Today they're represented by the bunch of different groups: the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde, the Cowlitz Nation, the Chinook Nation, and the Confederated Tribes of the Siletz Indians. So we gather here today now to grow in our own stewardship for the land and pay our respects to the elders. But we also acknowledge the cultural erasure that took place for these people and continues to take place today. And if you're curious, this is a really cool website that shows you can put in like an address and it'll show where that star is Portland, and so it'll tell you historically where tribes and where people historically have been and continue to be. So today we're going to talk about some really fun stuff. I'm just really excited to share with you all sort of a fall gardening preview. We're going to talk first about fall vegetable garden. Well, we, meaning Emily, is going to talk about that. And then I'm going to continue and we'll talk about landscaping tasks and tips for the season coming up. There's going to be a deluge of information. There's just so much. There's no other way to say it. So we're going to be sending a lot of resources, and hopefully, I can give you a little taste so that you can, if you're interested in something, explore a little bit more. And at the end, we want to hold some time for questions and answers. I think the presentation should take about 50 minutes. And then we have like up to a half an hour for questions and answers, or just conversation, things that you're noticing in the garden, things that you're looking forward to. This is definitely a place for that. Yeah. So a little bit about me. In the bottom left, that was like the first sort of nature-scaped yard that I ever worked on when I lived in Forest Grove. That was the townhome. Well, it was pretty tall, but the yard was really small, and that was the first place that I got really interested in creating landscape with mostly native plants, but definitely incorporating a lot of food there as well. And so there's my little alley of raspberries, blackberries on the left, and then on the right, a variety of native plants, salal and snowberry and Oregon grapes, things like that. In the middle picture, I'm in my happy place at Bosquedel Native Nursery. If you haven't been to Bosquedel in West Lynn, it's a wonderful place. Wonderful place. All native plants for sale, and just a really beautiful environment to be in. So just, yeah, plant shopping. And then I'm an educator with Metro, the regional government. And on the right, there's just me being a goof at Blue Lake Park, where I'm the head gardener for the Blue Lake Natural Discovery Garden there. So pass it on to Emily.
Hey guys, so my name's Emily, and I work for the organization Growing Gardens, which I'm excited to tell you guys a little bit more about. My background, I originally started as in agriculture, so running some about 2-acre farms, and then continually getting smaller and more urban until now. My current iteration is I'm a backyard gardener, and I do garden-based education, so teaching people how to grow their own food at home. And do far less growing of my own food than I would like. But I guess I would say I also am currently in a role at Growing Gardens where we do some virtual garden consultations for folks that are, especially during COVID, wanting to start gardening and are looking for resources, looking for advice, don't know where to start. So I do those on a weekly basis, and then I'm also my favorite part about gardening is just that I'm a forever learner, so I get to learn a lot from other folks all the time, and it never gets boring. Oh,
I actually could give it to you. So
I see that.
yeah, the remote control feature. Yeah, I just saw that. But
I'm not seeing the thing at the bottom.
oh, there it goes.
Oh, there it goes. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Cool. So here's a little bit about Growing Gardens. We're a nonprofit based in Portland. We serve all of Oregon. It was started in 1996, so a little over 24 years old. We have 3 main programs. So our Home Gardens program works with families that have limited resources to help them grow their own food at home in their backyards. So we help them build backyard gardens and then offer seeds and plant starts and tools and classes and mentoring to really help people be successful in producing their own food at home. Our Youth Grow program works with high poverty elementary schools and now some high schools to do garden-based hands-on education, connecting to math and science standards, teaching during the school day, as well as mentoring teachers to help them entwine their curriculum with the hands-on education in the garden. And then our Lettuce Grow program, which works in all of the Oregon State Correctional Facilities. We work with inmates. We teach the OSU Master Gardener course and produce, around 400,000 pounds of vegetables every year that go back into the facility kitchens and also get donated to local food banks in the often rural areas where the prisons are located. And I guess one thing I love about working at Growing Gardens is this real acknowledgement of where, particularly in our food system and in our cities and urban planning, noticing who's left out of the conversation. As Jacob was talking about the erasure of Indigenous people, and I think a lot of times, I don't know how, your guys' learning throughout gardening has been, but it's often a very kind of Western Eurocentric model that's often taken a lot of knowledge from Indigenous people. And so really working to bring back that recognition of this knowledge and of where we are at. And so anyways, so hopefully I'll weave it in a little bit throughout my talk, but yeah, it's a wonderful organization. So if you guys haven't heard of it, or if you have, check us out.
Okay.
So
Go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, so today I'm going to talk about, these are kind of my main talking points: planning for your fall and winter garden. What are the things you can plant right now? And right now is really an awesome time for getting things started in the garden. And by right now, I mean August, early August. Different things you can do to help protect your soil over the winter, and then a little run through on cover crops. Was there something you wanted to say, Jacob? Oh. Oops.
No, it was just like, all right, let's go.
trying to get the use of, there's a little bit of a delay on this PowerPoint. Okay, all right, so the first thing about understanding how to really maximize and get this full year-round harvest, which we live in a climate where it is pretty not too challenging to actually have food growing in your garden year-round and be eating from your garden year-round. And so the biggest thing with that is to really realize actually that most of the vegetables that you're going to be eating throughout the winter and fall are not actually going to be growing over the winter because there's not enough sunlight. So what the aim is you want to get everything to be full size by the time that they stop growing. That way the garden sort of acts as a natural refrigerator. So then, you know, you can see this kale here is full size. So that's basically, you're going to be eating that kale. You can just harvest it throughout the winter. But it's important not to plant it too late, because if you wait until, you know, September, October to plant some of these things, they're not going to get to full maturity. So they'll be really small, and then the winter comes and it'll live through the winter and you can harvest whatever you can harvest. But in spring, it won't keep growing in the same way, because once the sun starts returning and the warmth, the plants get a signal to basically go into reproductive mode. So that kale is just going to go and flower as soon as the spring starts. So really for most things, and I'll go over a planting calendar, early August is really an ideal time to be planting a lot of things like kale, you know, all of your brassicas, your root vegetables. And you can wait a little bit longer for some of the quicker succession crops like lettuce and radish. So in a general term, in a sort of botanical term, the things that you want to be planting right now, the things that are going to survive over the winter, are things that where the plant produces a leaf and where the plant produces a root. Or, you know, obviously all plants produce root and leaves, but the thing you eat is a leaf, or the thing you eat is a root. Those are the plants that are often prefer cooler weather, and they are very frost tolerant. So most of these will pretty much just grow through the winter. You don't even need covering or anything like that unless it gets really bad. And then the sort of two plants that don't really fit into the leaf or root category are broccoli and peas. So this is my favorite planting calendar that I use, is the Portland Nursery calendar. So what I like about it is that it just goes month by month. So whatever month I'm in, August right here, I have a list of all the things that I can be seeding outdoors. The little asterisk here is when it's the best time. So I can be doing arugula, Asian greens, beet, broccoli rabe, cabbage. And then these are the things that I can start in early August. So their list is there. And you can find this on the Portland Nursery website, and we can send this out also in the follow-up email. September as well, you'll start to see things that you can grow, but tend to be a lot of the faster growing crops, obviously with the exception of garlic, which takes 240 days, and you can plant it in September or October. But you can see how once we get into October, there's fewer things that you can really seed outdoors other than your cover crops. And the shaded area is things that are going to be a fall harvest or an overwintering harvest. So you can see basically everything in this is going to be a fall or winter harvest. And then this is a calendar I also really like from Oregon Tilth that is really helpful in starting to think about the days to harvest and how you can plan out your garden based on when you want to be harvesting it. So the dotted boxes are when things need to be seeded, and the blue boxes are when things can be harvested. So the seeding window for basil to start by seed is March, April, and May. And then it takes 90 to 120 days. And the reason there's a range is because things grow slower when it's colder, and they grow a lot faster when it's warmer for the most part. So you can, the ones that you start in early March, 90 days gets you to June. So that's where you're starting to harvest those. Or bush beans, for example, start direct seed those in May, and in 2 months, July, you're going to be able to harvest them. And multiple months means that you can, plant them successively so that you really extend your harvest longer. So I just find this is a really helpful chart to look at when I'm starting to plan out my winter garden, because what I'm looking for is things that I'm harvesting either in the early spring. So for example, overwintering broccoli, you can start it in August, and it takes quite a few days. So it actually is going to be growing through the winter. And then, like I said, once the sun hits, that's when the plant is triggered to start flowering, which is what the broccoli is, a flower. And the best part about it is that for me, my sprouting broccoli is the first thing that I'm harvesting in the spring. And I've done basically no work, because all I've done is let it sit in the ground. The natural rains watered it. There was no weeding to do because the weeds weren't really growing. And then next thing I know, usually in March for me is when I'm just harvesting lots and lots of broccoli. So winter gardening is really awesome that way, in that really you're just planting it, and then nature kind of does its thing. There are a few tricks that I'll talk about as far as starting things in hotter weather, which can be a little tricky. So right now, just to recap, root vegetables, so carrots, beets, turnips, they tend to, those need to be, or they prefer generally to be planted by seed. You can transplant them, but because they're roots and the root is what they're producing, when you transplant, you just have to be careful that the roots aren't disturbed too much. I find that beets transplant decently well, but carrots I've never had great luck with. So, and if you are going to transplant them when they're pretty small. And honestly, this time of year for root vegetables is my preferred, because once the frost hits, the roots just concentrate lots of sugars in their roots. And so they are just the sweetest carrots and the sweetest beets that I've ever had. And they can just stay in the ground through the winter. So you don't need to pull them all out and put them in in some kind of a storage, root storage. You can do that. But pretty much unless we have a lot of sustained days of frost, then they'll just stay in the ground just fine. And you can harvest them as you want to eat them. But they should get harvested before spring hits, because that's going to trigger them to then start using the energy they've stored in the roots to go through the rest of their life cycle. So they get pretty rooty and not that delicious in the spring. Leafy greens, kale, collards, chard. Again, you want these to be full size by the end of October. So you can either plant them by seed, like right now, or wait a few weeks and you can plant them by start. And then you're just continually harvesting these huge leaves throughout the winter. Just walk out in your garden, grab what you want. And again, these also concentrate their sugars, so they tend to be really delicious. Broccoli, cabbage, and kohlrabi are just going to be one-time harvests. So there is a fall broccoli, which you'd plant now, and then you'll harvest it at the end of fall, when it is appropriate, when it looks like that, when you see the flower, but it hasn't fully flowered. And then, like I said, you can also plant the overwintering variety, which I prefer because there's not a lot else that my garden is producing in March, even though I've already started planting. That's one of the first things. And then cabbage, kohlrabi, again, those are one-time harvests that you can either plant and harvest in fall, or you can wait and harvest them during the winter whenever you want. And then plants that just have fewer days to maturity, so fewer days to harvest, are arugula, spinach, lettuce, radish. Those can be done, in a month and a half to 2 months. So you can just keep planting those basically until you get to about October. And then you'll just have a continual harvest. Oops. The one thing is I've had really good luck with spinach and arugula and radish in the just like living without much protection at all. But lettuce is the one thing that typically does need to have some kind of a plastic or a row cover or something to just prevent it from freezing. All right, trying to go to the next slide here.
And we did have a couple questions in the Q&A, and
Great.
when I went to go check, I accidentally advanced your slide. So I think you have to go check and to see
okay.
what they are if you
Got it.
feel like that's a good time to do it.
Any recommendations for dealing with the critters that demolish my kale? I guess it depends what is demolishing your kale. So typically the biggest one I have trouble with is, well, I guess there's a couple, is cabbage moth caterpillars. So they're those green ones. They blend in perfectly with whatever color your kale is, and they'll leave big bite marks. So for those, the thing that I do is actually just pick them off, because I can find them. I can search under the leaves and look for the eggs, which will you just squash them on the bottom of the leaf. Or you can use BT, which maybe Jacob, stands for Bactyltherius, which is
Bacillus thuringiensis.
Oh, thank you.
I just heard it yesterday.
Nice.
That was the only reason I remember.
I feel like I just always call it BT, and the word is intimidating. But that's something that's actually like a naturally occurring chemical that plants produce themselves, and they've figured out how to synthesize it, I think, or not totally sure, but it works great against like soft-bodied like caterpillar types. Other things, it could be, obviously slugs are a big thing, especially in the cooler. Once it gets colder and wetter, slugs are a big deal. The only thing I've really found that works for me for slugs, or my particular brand of slugs that I've got in my garden, is the organic Sluggo, which is safe for kids and pets. I've tried beer, I've tried copper, I've tried a lot of things, eggshells, diatomaceous earth. So that's just a hard one. I think keeping your garden kind of clear of places for them to hide and breed can be helpful. And then I guess the other one would be aphids. Aphids are going to look like really, they kind of have gray bodies, kind of flaky looking. And aphids can, basically, they can't really live unless they're attached to the plant and feeding on the plant. So I try and stay on top of the pests so I see when they're coming. Because once an infestation gets really bad, then at that point I usually just will pull off whatever leaf they're infesting and toss that. But if you can catch them early enough when there's like just a couple, then just spraying them off with your hose, knocking them off the plant, spraying them with a little soapy water, that has always worked just fine for me. Trying to think what other things. Leaf miners are one that don't attack kale, but they do attack your chard. You'll see the little like trails of under the leaves, and there aren't really any sprays or anything that work for those because they're larvae that live inside the leaf. And so the best thing to do for those is, as you start to see the little like sort of white trails, just pull those leaves and throw them in the compost, and that'll usually stop their spread. So let's see, was there another question? When will lettuces need protection? Yeah, basically just before the first frost. They'll live through, basically just watch the nighttime temperatures, and when those get below freezing, then just cover them. But they will prefer to have some sort of protection even before then. They'll just be a little happier. But yeah, mostly just when it gets cold, and that can be yeah, usually our first frost date is like October 31st or November 1st. So, but you just have to watch the weather because sometimes it can be cooler before that or after that. I think that's all the questions I see right now. So tips for planting in hot weather. So you have these cool season vegetables that you need to plant right now, but it's pretty hot right now. So that's where you kind of have this tricky situation where it's just more challenging, basically, because you need to keep the seeds moist, obviously, like seed starting anything. And so my trick for that is to, even in my in-ground garden, where I'm gardening in like just our clay soil, I'll actually add a bit of potting soil to my rows where I'm planting because it'll hold the moisture really well. You can cover your soil, but basically just keep watering. Make sure they just stay as wet as you can, because they will just at this time of year, the water will evaporate really fast. I also will typically, because at this time in my garden, I actually don't have a ton of space because I went crazy with planting tomatoes and, squash and things like that. So oftentimes I don't have a ton of open ground to be planting things in. So instead, I'll start things on my back porch in potting soil, which means that I see it every day. I can water it every day. I can move it into the shade if it's a really hot day. And it just helps me, it both helps me like monitor the seedlings so that I can keep them moist and not let them dry out until they germinate. And it means I can wait a couple more weeks as those starts get larger, and I can even pot them up so that just to give the things that are currently in my garden a little bit more time to produce things before I pull them out in order to plant my fall and winter garden. And then as far as starts, the thing that I do whenever I transplant in its hot weather is I will dig the hole that they're gonna go in, and I will, before I put the plant in at all, I will fill the hole with water. And basically what that does is just allows all of the soil underneath the hole, which is where ultimately you want your plant roots to be reaching down as low as possible to get that water. Filling up the hole and then letting the hole drain means that all the soil surrounding the hole is going to be wet too. Then I put the plant in with some compost, usually a little bit of organic fertilizer, cover it back up, and then I water it again. So then the second watering is really getting the roots and starting to help the plant sort of find its home in that hole. And then just watering very deeply, just to really encourage that plant, the water to go as deep as possible, which then means that the plant roots are going to go as deep as possible, so that even if the top of the soil dries out, the plant is still getting access to the water that's deeper in the surface that hasn't dried out. Add sand to hold water. I have added, yeah, we could go into a whole thing about like soil texture versus, the chemical and biological compositions of soil. For me, I've always actually added sand as a sort of way of helping drain my clay soil, but I think you just know, just working in your own soil, you start to figure out what are the traits of your soil. How quickly does it dry out? How quickly does it drain? Does the water pool or does it drain? And you can I think it's a lot about knowing your own soil and knowing which practices are going to work the best for your soil. So for example, and this sort of answers Susan's questions about what is about potting soil that makes it absorbent. So there's usually a couple things that potting soil will have. It'll have usually either peat moss or coconut coir, which, peat moss is coming from like the bogs. It's actually not something great for the environment as far as how it's harvested. But yeah, potting soil typically has a combination of things that usually includes compost, sand, vermiculite or perlite or pumice, and then something that helps that both helps keep moisture like a sponge, but also allows the soil to drain, which I know sounds sort of counterintuitive, but soil blocker potting soil recipe. Oh yeah, I could send that if you guys have soil blocks or blockers. That's a great way to do it. And yeah, you can make your own potting soil. I can send that to Jacob. Yeah. I don't do that hardly anymore. I don't have a soil blocker anymore. I just buy potting soil now and use recycled materials. But yeah, those blockers are great as far as you know, you don't need a pot. Okay. Let's see if I can find the start. Come on. Oh, maybe I need to, oh, there we go. Did I skip one? Okay. All right. So then this stuff is also, I think, pretty intuitive. And I know Jacob's going to talk more about this in a landscaping context, but a lot of how I learned and like continue to learn about gardening is through watching nature and through a lens of what is nature already doing and what systems has nature already perfected to create vibrant ecosystems and not needing to invent the wheel. And so just like in the fall, you know, the leaves fall from the deciduous trees and they cover the ground, and it provides a natural, and the plants die and they cover the ground. So that's, you know, what we can do in our own gardens, which are more, you know, less natural in a lot of ways because of the domesticated plants that we're working with and just our own human intervention. So I usually use things that will break down like leaves or straw. You can also use like burlap sacks, which aren't going to break down, but they'll cover the soil, and then you can pull them up and, you know, use them in your pathways or something. Cardboard also works well, and if it can either be broken, it either will break down enough that you can plant into it into the spring, or if it hasn't, then you can, again, remove it and put it in a pathway. And then I think the biggest thing that I would recommend, if you haven't done this yet in your garden, or it's something you want to try, is to plant a cover crop. Because ultimately our gardens and our vegetable gardens being productive and supporting healthy plant life really means having a healthy soil. And so a healthy soil is obviously more than just the, you know, chemical or you know, the components that are not alive, but actually the soil is very alive, and all the microorganisms and the macroorganisms and bacteria are all living. So having roots that are alive in the soil is actually really beneficial to all that soil health ecosystem staying alive through the winter. And there's a lot of different reasons. Different cover crops do different things, and I'll briefly go into that, but we'll also send you guys a follow-up resource. But the idea of a cover crop is you're going to plant it, usually, you know, in the fall sometime. Most cover crops are plants that are going to germinate well in cooler weather, stay alive over the winter, and then you're going to basically kill them, pull them out, and then incorporate them into your soil in the spring. Or, you know, pull them out and add them to your compost bin if you want to do that. But really it's a great way to add organic matter into your soil. A lot of the plants that can be used for cover crops, or that folks use for cover crops, will fix nitrogen, which they actually don't do it themselves, but they have a symbiotic relationship with a bacteria that lives on the root that actually is able to take nitrogen that's in a gaseous form, so it's not available to plants, And that bacteria is actually able to take that nitrogen and convert it into nitrogen that's available to the plant. So then the plant can use that nitrogen to grow all of its green parts, rather than nitrogen that's in the soil. And then when you incorporate that plant into your soil at the end of at the end of winter and the beginning of spring, you're actually taking all that nitrogen that the plant has acquired from the air, from gaseous form, and you're actually adding it into your garden as nitrogen that's available for plants. So it's basically free nitrogen, which we know is one of the biggest nutrients that plants need in order to grow, because it helps produce all of the green parts of the plant. Not all cover crops do that, though, just the legumes, really. And then there's also cover crops that, if your soil is really compacted, there are root cover crops that are like oilseed radish that will actually basically just like drill down into your soil to actually help break up compaction. So they do a lot of work for us in our garden. They also do require some work. And I want to give a shout out, speaking of, ways in which we can appreciate the contributions, particularly of folks of color, African Americans, to our agricultural knowledge, is George Washington Carver, who a lot of people know of because of, the peanut. But he actually was a huge proponent of the lands in the South were really nutrient depleted from all of the cotton. And so he actually was the one who introduced growing legumes in between years of cotton in order to regenerate the nitrogen that was being taken out of the soil. So I want to give credit there. And this, again, I think I like this resource from Portland Nursery, is a great way to just get to know what different types of cover crops there are out there. And really, like I said, think about your soil and what your soil needs. So this little description has basically what type of soil this is going to be best for. So, for example, annual ryegrass, tolerant of hard, difficult soils. Excellent at growing at lower temperatures. So this one you can actually plant through November, which is nice because a lot of times you don't have a ton of open soil to be planting things in September. Versus something like crimson clover, it doesn't love as much, it's not as easily germinating in cooler weather, although it is, and you can plant it basically through October. But the ones that are going to fix nitrogen, Austrian field peas, this is one of my favorites. Again, you can plant it through December, so it's very, very cold tolerant, and it one of the biggest ones that add nitrogen into your soil. Crimson clover, I also love. It also fixes nitrogen and is just beautiful. If you decide you want to leave some of it to flower, then it's just nice for pollinators. And favas also are fixing nitrogen. Oilseed radish, these are the ones that create they have these deep tap roots that will actually basically help break up soil. So anyways, I recommend checking these out and thinking about which ones you might want to do. And just as like a full disclaimer, so that you know what it looks like in the spring if you decide you want to go this route, just be aware that there is some work in the spring. So basically you'll have to figure out a couple weeks before you want to start planting your first plants, which for most of us is usually in the very end of February, maybe getting your peas in, but usually it's like March. So sometime usually mid-February, whenever there's that break where it's not too wet, usually we have a couple weeks where the rains kind of stop just for a little bit. That's when you want to basically turn in your cover crop. So you can sort of see the picture here, just chop it in with a shovel, turn it over. A lot of them you can just mow down and that'll kill them. or, you know, cover it with something like cardboard to try and smother it, or pull it out if you don't have a lot of time, you don't have enough time for it to break down before you want to plant. So, so a lot of folks don't want to necessarily go through this in their gardens. It's, you know, can be a little more energy intensive. So, which is why, you know, sometimes just mulching is totally good enough. But if you are interested in the free nitrogen or all of the other benefits of a cover crop, then I would highly recommend it. And you can buy a lot of them in bulk. So you don't have to buy, you know, you can buy just as much as you need, and they have the, you know, pounds per square footage that you want to sow them. So I've gotten mine at Portland Nursery. And they also sell mixes, so that if you don't want to choose just one, there's a mix of different things so that you have a variety of plants that are helping your soil in different ways. And I think that's it. Back to you, Jacob. Oh, I guess let me check and see if there's any questions real quick.
Yeah, go ahead and take a question or two while we're still thinking about veggies.
Okay.
Yeah. Also, you can give me the remote control back.
Oh yeah. A light layer of fine gravel to a bed. Yeah. Yeah, I do. That's one thing that any of you follow the work of Steve Solomon, who wrote the book Vegetable Gardening West of the Cascades. He talks about in our soils, because they're so clay heavy, that adding what he calls gravel fines, basically fine gravel, to our soils can help break up some of that compaction and be really beneficial to our overall soil health. Mulching is great, but also provides a lot of cover for slugs. Yes, it's true. That's the trade-off. It's just kind of, you got to choose. Yeah, sometimes maybe, I know Jacob's going to talk a little bit about like running over the leaves with your lawnmower, so breaking it up into a sorry, this question answer is like blown up right now.
Sorry, it was because I was removing some of the ones that have been answered. I thought I was making it easier.
Good. Oh, okay, cool. Thank you. It just started moving on its own.
Oh, that was me.
List some best cover crops. What are the best cover crops? Well, so yeah, it does depend on your soil. My favorites have always been Austrian field peas, which, as Anna says, you can eat the shoots also. Although typically, I know some people who actually will grow them, like for favas, example, and actually eat the favas. But for me, what I'm mostly interested in is the actual retaining all of that organic matter and nutrients into the garden. So I usually kill them before, or I usually chop them in before they're actually producing peas. But yeah, my favorites are Austrian field peas, crimson clover, because I like that nitrogen. And yeah, when I was farming, I used a lot of winter rye. It just is your preference. But yeah, I think Austrian field peas and crimson clover are a great way to start. Some of the ones that are grasses, like the rye grasses, they can get a little, if you don't chop them down at the right time, they can end up like persisting and being a little bit of a headache. So maybe steer away from those if you haven't done a cover crop before. Is Growing Gardens still able to take volunteers and plant gardens for folks during COVID-19? Yes, we have. Maybe at the end I'll talk more about that if anyone's interested. But yeah, we aren't really working with volunteers, but we are still building the gardens for folks and basically running all of our programming. We're just doing classes or online. Our like distribution of materials is a lot different. And the way we build the gardens is a lot different. We're not working with lots of volunteers. We're working with usually just 1 to 2 folks and maintaining that social distance. So, and also, you know what, we don't have to talk more about that. Just reach out to me afterwards if you have any interest in volunteering or you're interested in the program, whatever it is. So I think that's all the questions. Thanks, guys.
Sounds good. Those are great. Those are great questions, and keep them coming. And if we can't get to them now, we'll try to at the Q&A. And if we can't get to the Q&A, we'll reach out to you individually, either Emily or myself. So quick time check. We're running a bit behind, but like I'm okay with that. It's all good. We're getting good questions and stuff. So I'll keep it rolling. And if we run a little bit short on like the questions, and it might kick us out with the questions and answers portion, but just know that that's what happens if the lights turn off or something. Well, I don't think they will, but yeah, we are going a little bit behind schedule. That's all good. So I want to talk about some landscaping tasks, and there's certainly overlap between talking about growing vegetables at home and what we're doing in our gardens for some of our ornamental species, native species as well. So we're going to talk about caring for lawns, talk about planning for tree and shrub plantings. It's very exciting for me. Creating habitat, you can do that in every season, and fall is no exception to that. And there's also no exception to weeding. Depending on the season, you get different weeds, but there are always, the fact of the matter is there are always weeds in gardens. So I really like OSU monthly garden calendars for like a very broad sort of snapshot of some of the different things that you can be doing based on the month. So check that out. We'll send that out as well. It also has information on like houseplants, which I'm pretty keen on. So I like that aspect. So I'm going to start out my portion with a poll. So you should have something come up on your screen. Which of these tasks is generally not best to do in early to middle of fall? So I'll just leave that open for a minute or so and let folks answer there as you're able. Sometimes the polling is weird, like you can't quite get to it, or your browser does some funny stuff, but to the best of your abilities. Go ahead. Okay. A little bit, maybe like 5-10 more seconds. Let those last votes come in. Most of us have. That's good. Right. So it looks like most of us have got the answer that I was thinking, which is pruning shrubs and pruning shrubs and trees. And there are exceptions to like plants don't fit in boxes, and there are exceptions to everything. Like there might actually be a case where you would want to prune a shrub if it has just flowered, for instance. But generally speaking, we want to do a lot of the hardest pruning late in fall, or even better yet, like winter when things are dormant. So yeah, thanks for participating in that. So the first thing we're going to be talking about is lawn care. And there's so many, lawns are really high maintenance systems. It's crazy. It's crazy to think about how something that is in a lot of cases just lawn grass, just one species of like a fescue, would be so high maintenance. But it is, and some of the things that you should be thinking about in the fall is dethatching. So if you have a pileup of dead grass material that's creating a mat, and if it gets to be more than half an inch or so, I would definitely think about dethatching. So you can see the photo in the top right. That is a thatch rake, and it is a super sharp tooth rake that you use to pull across the lawn and it scrapes some of that dead material and some of the living material out, and basically creates furrows or little spaces, leaving the living lawn grass. And that breaks up, it it allows space for the grass that remains to branch out and form a nice mat, which is pretty much what we're looking for with lawn grass, right? And aerating, so that in the bottom right, you'll see that is a core aerator that you attach to a tiller, like a walk behind tiller. They come in other forms, the core aerators, but they pull out plugs of your soil and allow more pore space, more empty space for those grass to develop deeper roots, and allow nutrients and water to get lower down into the grass's roots, which will help it be more resilient of a lawn and just healthier, more able to fight off pests and things like that. And my my colleague, he loves talking to people about lawn care, and he says one of the first things that he asks people is like, when they're having lawn problems, have you overseeded? And usually the answer is, what's overseeding? And so it's basically amounts to using 25 to 50% of the rate of seeding for a new lawn establishment, and applying that over grass after you've done that dethatching if necessary, and the aeration if necessary. You can sprinkle a little bit of compost on top of this, a tiny bit, maybe quarter of an inch of compost on top of what you have just, the seed that you've put out, and that'll help keep it moist. And that will just help it get a little bit of a head start. And all of these things are coming up second week of September. Between mid-September and mid-October, we're thinking about getting a lot of these things done. As the seeding window is probably the most critical of this operation. Just thinking about usually when the rains have just started, and there's a little bit of warmth, that these species of grass that we usually plant in our lawns can get going, but there's still moisture. So it's kind of a sweet spot with doing that overseeding operation. And then fertilizing, applying an organic fertilizer, nothing that's too high in nitrogen. Try and keep those numbers low when we think about the N, P, and K, the nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Try and keep those numbers low, maybe keep that to a 444. Anything more, and because the lawn grass roots they're usually not that deep, they won't be able to absorb something if you put, I think it's some sort of sulfur compound that's like 20-0-0. They're just not going to be able to absorb most of that nitrogen, and then that runs off. And this is also a really good time of year, that window, mid-September, mid-October. That's a good time to think about establishing a new lawn. So if you've got a place that is mostly free of weeds, gets good sun, it's a good time to think about establishing a new lawn so that the rain helps you out with that operation. Soon we should have our natural lawn care webinar on our YouTube page, which we'd love to share with you all if you're interested. Let's talk a little bit more about overseeding and top dressing. I know I'm just kind of glancing over these things, but I want to talk just a tiny bit more about that. Oops, not that one. It would be that one. So most people are using a handheld broadcast spreader, unless you work for a nursery or have one of the walk behind ones too. Like I said, there's a good rule of thumb for a new lawn seeding rate. both with the overseeding and with the new lawn establishment, seeding, you could consider using an eco lawn mix. I have used a few times it's the ProTime, ProTime in Southeast Portland on Ankeny. They they sell, and they sell at Portland Nursery too, I think. They sell an eco lawn mix, which is a mix of, instead of it just being rye or fescue, or bent grass or something like that, they'll put in some broadleaf plants as well. So different micro clovers, micro strawberries, yarrow, which is a native plant. And these things have a lot of benefits, drought tolerant. They don't naturally go, like their leaves don't get as dry and crispy as grass leaves do in the summer. So give that a consideration. It takes a little bit longer to establish, but once it's there, it's more resilient than just a straight one lawn grass species. And after seeding, it's a good idea to run a rake over the seeds. Sometimes they can just kind of like stick to the grass blades or whatever. You want to make sure there's good soil contact. The core aeration and the dethatching, that can help also create space for some of these seeds to touch the soil and eventually germinate. And like I mentioned before, just a thin layer of compost over the top as a mulch, keep those moist. That really is a crucial part of it, keeping it moist. And yeah, and so if you're interested in just reading a little bit more about lawn care, you can check out our website, oregonmetro.gov/lawn, for more tips. And I wanted to talk about avoiding pesticides like weed and feed. For those of you who don't know, weed and feed is kind of they call it like a double duty product. So it's got, on the one hand, it's got a synthetic fertilizer, which is really, really high in nitrogen derived from urea, I think. And then on the other hand, you've got a broadleaf herbicide, something that doesn't specifically target your grass, but targets broadleaves, and that's 2,4-D is the specific one in weed and feed, and it's applied before the weeds come out. So even before you have a weed problem, that's when they're saying you should put this pesticide and synthetic fertilizer on your lawn. And there are a bunch of different reasons to avoid using synthetic pesticides and fertilizers. For human health, there are, there are studies that link 2,4-D, for example, to non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, though there's some meta-analysis that scholars are doing to sort of argue about whether or not you can make that connection. But it is very possibly an endocrine disruptor. And also lawns, children and pets are usually the ones who are using our lawns a lot, and they're the ones who are most likely to suffer from exposure to some of these chemicals. And the half-life of 2,4-D is really long. It doesn't just go away after a week. Even though you can't see the granules, it's still there. Soil health, pesticides, alter the soil health, but like I said, the fertilizers as well. And a lot of times they just go through, they get into the soil, and then they speed up the decomposition cycle to an unnatural rate and eat up all the organic matter in your soil. So if you're trying to grow vegetables or something that needs nitrogen, which is, I guess, all plants, then eventually you might see a bump, like a spike, when you have synthetic fertilizers applied, but later when it eats up the organic matter, you're going to have not as good general plant health, and you're not going to have, plant's not going to be able to take up the nitrogen as well. And then fertilizers often run off, pesticides run off. It is a huge problem in our waterways to have pesticides and fertilizers, and we don't have a great way to remove those. Well, fertilizer is a little bit better way to remove it, but pesticides is incredibly challenging work, and to get those out in like a wastewater treatment context even. And we can also, I just like to think about this in a regional context, because I think it's something that's quite politicized and it's easy to pick a side, but we know certain things about um, how our region uses pesticides and fertilizers. If you're looking for a really good comprehensive lawn care resource, I would also recommend checking out the Practical Lawn Care for Western Oregon. I think that's a nice one. But just touching on those patterns, we know from studies done in our metro region that 39% of area residents use weed and feed, and 52% of adults 55 and over use weed and feed, and 54% of people with incomes between 50,000 and 75,000. So it's older people who are very well-to-do who are using pesticides, and they're not necessarily feeling the impacts of that use. Those impacts come downstream on the water system, on people hired to apply these chemicals and things like that. So I think there's sort of a social conscience that can be had about thinking about using some of these products too. And as I mentioned before, possible carcinogen, probable endocrine disruptor. It tends to mimic the shape and function of hormones in our bodies and throw off the cycles. So I talked about that. Okay, so let's talk about fall planting. Now's a good time to start planning what you're going to incorporate. It's good to do all these planting projects. Probably, I wouldn't really be thinking about it until after mid-October, when you have consistent rains, and in a lot of cases it's good when the soil is like actually pretty damp already, to start planting. Sometimes it can be harder to move around, but the plants love it. When the plants are going into dormancy, or nearly all the way into dormancy, or just dormant, is a great time to do that. So you can do fall planting, you do winter planting as well, but probably realistically we're talking more about late fall planting. If you're interested in incorporating native plants into wherever you garden, if you're gardening a community garden or your backyard or helping your neighbor out, check out native plant sales around the area. East Multnomah Soil and Water Conservation District has a one-pager, maybe a one-page front and back, which tells you more or less when these sales are going to come up. It's cool to think about in the fall, we can still put things in that are going to be really interesting during the winter. And we have some native species that can provide a lot of winter interest, even when there aren't a whole lot of flowers to be had. So snowberry has a really nice white berry, which birds also happen to love. Red twig dogwood, which is the bottom right photo. The stems are just gorgeous. They're the seed heads of perennial grasses, different native bunch grasses, Deschampsia. Yeah, those are also a way to keep that interest going through the landscape, the fall into winter. And in fall, we can also work to create habitat. Yeah, Emily touched on this. Is just leaving the leaves, taking a pointer from Mother Nature. It's just leaving the leaves. Those are great habitat for salamanders and newts, and among other things. And bunch grasses is just sort of holding off on really heavily pruning any bunch grasses in the fall, and just do that in the spring, right as you see new growth emerging in the spring, then cut back your perennial bunch grasses if that is part of your gardening practice, because that leaves good overwintering habitat for beetles, ladybugs as well, lady beetles or beetles that can help you out in the garden too. Seed heads, birds, if you take away all the seed heads in the winter, then birds are less inclined to visit your yard. So if you can bear it, I would say definitely lead those up. And just in general, avoiding a fall cleanup mentality. A lot of times when plants start to go dormant or things like that, and things start to look a little shaggy, people get in a rush and is like, oh, I have to eliminate this so that my neighbors can, I don't know, think that I'm a good gardener or whatever. I don't know. People have different reasons for it. I asked my dad one time why he did it, and he's just like, that's just what you do. So, but as best you can, just kind of tidy up the edges. If you must do some tidying, which I totally get, or maybe something is flopped over on a path, absolutely, clean that up. But the more you can hold off, the more restraint you can have, probably the better in a lot of cases. If the leaves fall on your lawn, you don't necessarily have to rake them up in some cases, especially if they're like still a little bit dry. If you mow over them multiple times, that can just be really good, act as really good compost for your lawn, which is going to help in the spring for it to be really vibrant when it's ready to grow really strongly. So I'm going to see if I have any questions. Okay, roses get their first pruning in the fall. Yes. So depending on what kind of shape you're going for, and also depending on what kind of rose you're growing, I would say yes. And I'm doing pruning right now on roses, but not really structural pruning. I'm just deadheading and sort of shaping is what I would say. But I'm not cutting it down to 2 or 3 buds above the soil level at this point, if that makes sense. I'm usually waiting until President's Day to do the most dramatic pruning. So usually February, winter. The rabbits in my neighborhood thrash my lawn. I'm sorry to hear that. I'm curious what you mean by that. Maybe you can follow up on that. Can I talk specifically about converting grassy areas to wildflowers? Yes. So grassy areas aren't the most productive ecosystems. They don't provide the best habitat value for a lot of animals. They are great places for humans to recreate. I won't deny that, and they're really good at taking foot traffic. But certainly a wildflower meadow, if you have a place that gets a lot of sun, that you'd like to see the habitat value of that place increase, it's a great thing to think about, encouraging that towards a wildflower meadows. I would say you want to kill off the grass as best you can, and there are different ways you can do that. Non-chemical methods would be like removing, just sort of stripping off the sod with a flathead shovel. There are also what are they called? They're walk-behind machines which strip the sod. They have like teeth that go back and forth like this. I'm blanking on the name of it, but a sod cutter, of course. A sod cutter, you can go over the lawn, and that'll get, especially because lawn grass is fairly shallowly rooted. So if you've got lawn grass established, that might be all that it takes, maybe that a handful of times. You can also sheet mulch, which I am a big fan of, but it is maybe not what you want to do for like a wildflower meadow, because it adds so much organic matter to it. So if you're converting an area to like shrubs or trees or something like that, I would say sheet mulching is totally the way to go. But my views on this have evolved a little bit over time, but just I'm seeing that many nutrients for a wildflower meadow encourages more weeds because weeds love the nutrients, and oftentimes wildflowers, like at least native ones, don't require that. They don't require the fertility that is required to grow vegetables. Like, so I would say probably your best bet if you're trying to convert to meadow is just strip the sod, be patient. Maybe you have to strip it again. Um, and yeah, so that might be a good way to go with that. And then seeding. Oh, seeding is a whole nother thing for the meadows. But if you want, feel free to reach out to me directly and talk more about this. There's also a meadowscaping handbook from West Multnomah that I can refer you all to. What about preen? I believe preen is a pre-emergent. So it's a pesticide and it's a fertilizer, I think, that is applied to tackle broadleaf weeds. I'm not sure if it's the same active ingredient, but it's pretty much the same story as weed and feed. So I highly recommend avoiding that at all, if at all possible. Yeah. Okay, I'm gonna move on. So like I was saying, I'm qualifying this by saying major pruning. So we can hold off on our major pruning for now. So late winter is a good time, and it's a good time to do some of that pruning because there'd be fewer diseases present. It will stimulate growth when it becomes spring. Things are going to be growing really vigorously after doing some of that heavy pruning. I know I pruned 10-year-old elderberries that were 20 feet tall to the ground in the winter, and now they're 15 feet tall and now they have a really great form. So they have a really nice structure. So big fan of that. So yeah, an exception to this, another exception is to say that after things have flowered, if you have a shrub that flowers on next year's growth, right, then you would want to hold off you would want to prune right after it's flowered, before the flowers for next year have formed, if that makes sense. And then we can also hold off on, a good reason to hold off on some of our heavier pruning and like immediately removing material from the places that we're gardening is to just preserve habitat for cavity nesting species. So there are just so many ways that animals will use brush, and we can even tie these up and make them look a little bit more kempt without removing them from our yards. So, and we also want to stay on top of weeds, and in the fall, those are usually cool season weeds, especially towards the end. Manually control those annual weeds now, and you'll have fewer in spring. So a couple of examples of those would be willow herb, herb Robert, black medic. And then it depends. Sometimes you can just cut the growth of a perennial, but in some cases you'll need to root out a perennial. So you need to actually physically dig it out of the ground. Very soon we'll have a managing weeds naturally video on YouTube there. So that's all the information. Here's a bunch of resources. We'll put together a really good email to send out to you all, capturing all these resources that we've mentioned. But as I said, our YouTube page, Growing Gardens website, Practical Lawn Care, that's a good document. I didn't mention it, but Native Plants for Willamette Valley Yards, that is a publication that Metro did put together with some partners. And always check out East Multnomah's Soil and Water Conservation District because they have free presentations and resources. And they have, yeah, they have more coming up. I think there's going to be an urban weeds presentation in a few weeks. So that should be cool. Oh, the backyard habitat tool, from the backyard habitat certification program. They have an online tool which you can search for sources of native plants, just like in a Google Maps widget, which is really cool. And it tells you more or less how many native plants they're going to have. And so, for example, Livingscape in North Portland, they typically have between 10 and 25 different native species. So here's some fall inspirations. We have sedum, autumn joy, and various cone flowers, Russian sage, feather reed grass, and this is a wonderful scene from the Blue Lake Natural Discovery Garden. And fall is just a wonderful time to be out. Early fall is a wonderful time still for flowers. And fall is just, in general, a wonderful time to grow. And thank you for being with us here today and coming to grow a little bit with us as well.